Part 1. The happiest place on earth, Abby's story. My name is Abby, and I work in the happiest place on earth. Well, properly, I work in the Starbucks in the middle of Epcot. Day in and day out, I get to deal with impatient, rabid Disney families and the occasional inebriated college students dying to get their caffeine fixes. And all the while, I get to do it with the energy of a Disney princess moonlighting as a barista. It's not terrible, but trying to keep a cheery smile on my face and a certain pep in my step gets difficult sometimes. Especially lately. You see, I'm one of the newest hires. So I get tasked with all of the worst jobs, like running the huge bags of lat-saturated trash to the underground trash compactor, opening most days and closing most others, and the occasional odd job. What would turn out to be one of the scariest days of my life started like that, as an odd job. I dreaded it, sure, but it was innocent enough, right? The job was unusual right away, since it wasn't in my area. Hell, it wasn't even in Epcot at all. Back in the day, Disney used to operate a water park called River Country. Some of you Redditors will undoubtedly remember it fondly, as you should. In 2001, the park closed for good. Disney gave a lot of reasons why, but the real one was simple: they had a death on their conscience. Growing up in Florida like me, you hear a lot of talk about the brain-eating bacteria that live in the water. These are Naegleria fowleri, bacteria that live in warm freshwater. They can get to your brain through your nose and cause a fatal infection. Here in Florida, a kid will die of it every 10 years or so, and it'll be all over the news. Of course, it doesn't put you off jumping into the lakes and rivers. Your parents just tell you to hold your nose shut like all the other kids, and bam, no Naegleria fowleri for you. As it turns out, Disney's filtration system wasn't enough to get everything out. The water in River Country, pumped in from Bay Lake, was contaminated. How do I play into this? Well, as if the story of River Country isn't foreboding enough, all the lights and music still run at the place. I've heard a lot of reasons for it, everything from preserving the remaining magic to the notion that the light and sound system is shared with some of the resorts. Whatever the reason, someone has to go out and change those light bulbs when they go out. Last night, one went out and that lucky soul that was to replace it was yours truly. It certainly wasn't an assignment worth protesting, but I also wasn't looking forward to it. With the latest marathon running through the parks, the day was swamped. By the time I was able to grab the light bulb, the place lived up to my expectations at first. Nature had made some serious progress on taking everything over. The water was murky and green, calm at the surface, but with God knows what beneath it. Branches began to grow over the water slides. The beach area was no more. A sign stood at the entrance, cheerfully announcing the park was closed. The light bulb I was to change was located past the employee area, at the back of the park. As I walked, I kicked aside. By now, the sun was drawing close to the horizon. If I didn't get the job done soon, visibility would become an issue. I picked up my pace, but couldn't help but to shiver as I sped past the pool where that boy had caught his fatal infection. I was starting to grow uneasy, and it was starting to affect me. Every time I turned, I would see a shadow. At first, it just looked like people. Then children. Then, finally, I reached the employee hut. As I walked beyond it, I saw a glimpse of color behind the dusty window. Stopping dead, my heart starting to race, I debated turning around. The wind was picking up, and leaves were rustling all around me. Goosebumps rose up all over my skin. I decided against it and speed walked to the only dark light bulb on the property. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, the previously dead light bulb began to flicker. My heart nearly stopped, but I stepped forward anyway. Now, the light turned on and stayed bright. I took another few steps, then stopped in my tracks. Now, all of the rest of the lights in the park were flickering. In shock and fear, I dropped the light bulb I'd been carrying and it shattered on the ground. As the hairs on the back of my neck rose, I swear I heard something. And don't laugh, but damn it if it didn't sound like Goofy in the background. I know, it sounds insane. But when you spend as much time around the characters as I do, I knew his voice and his laugh. I would have recognized it anywhere. And I heard it echo through that place. The next second, all I could hear was my breath as I turned and ran. I tried to stop myself from looking through that window as I raced by, but I couldn't, and what I saw haunts me to this day. Goofy was behind the glass, dressed in his silly swimsuit with his inner. When I came to, it was pitch black and I was sitting in the first aid area of Epcot, surrounded by co-workers. Of course, they wouldn't tell me anything. Heat exhaustion, they said. Passed out at River Country, they said. Found by maintenance, they said. But I knew what I saw. I could hear the laughter ringing in my ears and feel the sticky toxic lake water fermenting on my work clothes. I could still feel the clammy hands on my skin. Part 2: The Dark Side of the Mouse, the cast members' story. Ever since the incident with Abby happened, all of us Disney cast members have been on edge. None of us want to work the night shift. Whispers seem to call from the shadows when we do. It's a little harder to keep up the plastic smiles, knowing what happened to one of us. But most of all, the anger at the higher-ups is constantly buzzing around the parks. Of course, the news of what happened when they told Abby she had to go back, she threw a fit. She screamed, she cried, and she had a panic attack, but it didn't matter. They had told her to change the light bulb, and change the light bulb she would. She begged and pleaded and demanded to know why maintenance wouldn't do it. It was a good point, of course. But all they would say is that the newest cast members have to go through some grunt work in a world where grunt work is the stuff they can't get anyone who knows any better to do. Abby told them that sounded an awful lot like workplace bullying and threatened to go to the authorities. It wouldn't have mattered if she did, since they'd throw her case out. We left right after my shift. I didn't even have time to change out of my Naveen outfit, so I ventured into the twilight dressed like a valiant prince, which was exactly the opposite of how I felt. Abby started to get really anxious as soon as we got close. She walked so close to me our skin touched, and I could feel her shake. As we approached the entrance to the abandoned park, I could see the rush of goosebumps rise on her skin. As much as my own heart was pounding, I let her into the park. Immediately, I noticed that all of the lights were out. Okay, there must be something wrong with the circuit. We can't do all of it, we'll have to get maintenance, I said with relief. A smile crept onto my lips despite the eerie, silent night. I want to see the employee hut, Abby said, her voice suddenly determined and angry. Before I could say anything, a huge laugh echoed throughout the park. I couldn't leave without her, so I went against everything my body was telling me and ventured in further towards the employee hut. Just like Abby had said, the glass on the window was shattered. Murky water had risen high in the hut and was lapping at the window. In it floated little white fragments that looked like bone. In the corner, bouncing against a wall with the flow of the water, was a plastic character eyeball. Against a window pressed a white gloved hand, completely detached from the rest of the costume. There was nothing there to keep it in place, but it stayed as if someone were pressing hard to get out. My stomach lurched. As I turned away, Abby was in my face. I flinched hard at what I saw, choking back a scream. As I stood there, frozen, the image of her standing there burned itself into my mind. Had it not been for the little blonde wisps of hair peeking out, I wouldn't have been able to identify her. Her head was encased in an ancient rotting Mickey Mouse character head, and her body reeked of lake water. Patches of moss covered the oversized Mickey ears. Lake water was dripping from every inch of the fur that remained. Fur was missing in patches everywhere. It looked like a huge bite had been taken out of the mouse's jaw. The left eye area was completely ripped away, down to the mesh, but I couldn't see anything but blackness behind it. And she stood there, unmoving, the mouse head sat crooked and off-center. Abby began to tilt her head to the left. "Help us," it hissed. And then, I'm ashamed to say, I turned and ran. In my struggle to get away, I tripped over one of the artificial rocks and fell hard. My hands and knees were all of a sudden slippery with blood that couldn't have been my own. I could hear clumsy, heavy footsteps approaching me, completely unlike anything Abby could have made. I turned around just to see the demented Mickey fall, seconds before I felt it hit me. The weight was crushing. The only thing I could THINK09 to do was to pry the Mickey head off. Her skin was white and clammy, burning hot to the touch. But that wasn't the reason I screamed. Lying there unmoving and unaware, Abby's eyes were wide open. Her mouth was frozen in a huge artificial smile. By all accounts, she looked dead, but I could feel her pulse beating irregularly under my fingertips. And so I carried her out of there, leaving the light bulb and the broken Mickey costume behind me. All the way to the car, she giggled. Never once did she blink, just giggle and giggle just like the Mickey characters do all day. Right before we arrived, Part 3 under the surface, I swear to God, this is why we don't send the new kids to do my job. It's common knowledge that Disney employees go through a hazing process when they're first hired. They get stuck doing some simple maintenance jobs, usually in the creepiest parts of the parks or resorts. It's supposed to be fun, you know? It's supposed to bring us all together. Of course, everyone knew it was bound to be a disaster, except it wasn't. For a long time, things were actually going okay. The new kids thought it was a fun little joke. And then little What's her face came along. Amy? Amelia? Abby? That's her. Then she got scared out at River Country, and everyone else got a little spooked. Okay, something a little creepy might have happened. Everyone was ready to move on with their lives. But then the bosses made her go back, maybe to show her there was nothing to fear. Pale, wide-eyed, mascara always smeared, fake smile plastered in place. She looked no more real than the animatronics. And she wouldn't speak to anyone but guests. She even ignored David. But she showed up every day nonetheless, stiff and frozen. But the worst thing was her walk. After her return, it was jerky, staggering. No one seemed to notice but me. A few days after she came back to work, the bosses finally gave the original job to maintenance. Change the light bulb and check out river country. Make sure there's nothing there that needs to be disposed of. After all, if anything got out to the public, it would be disastrous. And we couldn't have that. And that's how Jim and I found ourselves standing in the middle of the swampy, humid remains of river country. First of all, the place might look scary at night, but during the daytime, it's just pathetic. The water is gross and green, the buildings are falling apart, and the local wildlife is taking over everything. Gross, yeah. Scary? Maybe to a 22-year-old Starbucks. Max, Jim suddenly spoke up. Is that blood fresh? But it couldn't have been, because no one had been here for days. It must have been Abby's or David's dried blood from tripping and falling, or something else entirely. Nah, there's no way. Let's just change this bulb and get out. Yeah. I'm going to go look around while you do that. Two birds with one stone, you know? Jim proposed, clearly nervous. I shut my eyes and sighed. Sure. Don't fall in. And Jim, stop being a wuss. Yeah, of course, Max. And then he wandered off, leaving me to work in peace. The light bulb took just a moment. As I crouched with a handful of glass, I heard thundering footsteps and my name being yelled. In my surprise, I clenched my fist and drove the glass into my flesh. The pain was immediate. I heard the sound echoing through the park and the woods in my head. Jim was screaming it over and over, from somewhere deeper in the park. I found her, Jim said, breathless, as he approached, staggering and twitching. I found her, I found her, I found her, I found her. What's the matter with you? I yelled. Stop. His face was white, his eyes wide. He looked almost like Abby, but without that eerie smile. Gasping for air, he wouldn't stop saying it. I found her, he wheezed, as though in a trance. Even as he struggled for breath, he didn't blink. He didn't bend over. He didn't show any signs of obvious distress besides the gasps, and it was freaking me out. At any rate, I couldn't even hear myself think over his little message being repeated over and over and over. Show me, then. I finally yelled over Jim. Still whispering under his breath, he walked over to me, stiff as a board. He took my hand, which I immediately tried to pull away. But his grip was like a vice. A cold, clammy vice. Jim led me, slowly, through the park in a zigzag. The pace felt like a funeral march, but our path was going nowhere. Suddenly, Jim broke into a run, nearly pulling my arm out of its socket in the process. He ran with me, emitting a gut